The historical problem Islam faces is not Jesus, it's Muhammad.
Tell me how you got interested in this subject of the historical Jesus to begin with.
Well, I think it's very difficult to be interested in history and not be interested in the figure of Jesus, because there's a case for saying that he's the most influential human being who's ever lived. I mean, my interest in Jesus, I mean, it has many roots. I went to church and to Sunday school as a child, and I had a godmother who gave me, Bible stories, and the story of Jesus is a brilliant one. From the Christmas story through to the Passion and the Resurrection. I mean, it's a banger. And although I sometimes, as a child, got a bit muddled, in between those two bookends, you have these incredible parables. And I think whoever else he may have been, Jesus, if we assume that the parables that we get from him in the New Testament, are authentic, he has every claim to be the greatest short storyteller who's ever lived. I mean, they are so memorable and powerful. So I kind of grew up with them. I was familiar with them. As a child, I was much more interested in the Romans than I was in the disciples or indeed Jesus himself. And then I think what really sharpened it for me was I'd always had a vague sense that the evidence for Jesus was kind of weak. I'd read, as a kind of precocious atheist casting off my Sunday school learning, lots of books debunking the Old Testament and the historicity of Jesus. But then about 15 years ago, I wrote a book about the origins of Islam, and my sense had always been that the life of Muhammad was much better attested than the life of Jesus. And I was kind of basically writing that was a process of discovering that wasn't the case at all, that actually the seeming depth and detail that we have in the canonical lives of Muhammad is illusory, that these are much, much later, that they're kind of almost 200 years after Muhammad lived. And that then when I came to write Dominion and I had a chapter on Paul, I kept kind of bumping up against how incredibly close in time to the life and death of Jesus Paul was writing. And compared to the sources that you have for the life of Muhammad, I mean, it was astonishingly close. And so that then, I guess, kind of, it re-sparked an interest in who Jesus might have been, how reliable the Gospels and indeed Paul's testimony might be.
When historian Tom Holland explains how he became interested in historical Jesus, he admits something very important. For years, he assumed evidence for Jesus was weak. And like many modern leaders, he believed the life of Muhammad was far better recorded than the life of Jesus. Then he began researching the origin of Islam. And that assumption simply collapsed. Tom Holland explains that the detailed, confident pictures people have about Muhammad's life is misleading. Yup, misleading. The biographies of Muhammad, stories, sayings, and events Muslims often treated as historical fact come from the sources much, much later. So, Sirah, Hadith, all those things, they end up in history much, much later. Not close to the Muhammad's lifetime, but nearly 200 years after he lived. In other words, what looks like solid history is actually later tradition written long after the eyewitnesses are gone. Tom Holland calls this depth and detailed illusory. It feels rich, it feels complete, but historically it rests on much, much later material. Then Holland compares this with Jesus. While writing Dominion, he says he kept bumping up against something he could not ignore. The letters of Paul are amazingly close to the life and death and resurrection of Jesus. Paul was writing within living memory. He knew the eyewitnesses, he knew Jesus' own brother, and he preserved the beliefs about Jesus, his death, his resurrection, that scholars date to just a few years after the crucifixion. And this is where the comparison becomes uncomfortable for Islam. Jesus lived 600 years before Muhammad. He lived in poor occupied province of Roman Empire, right? No army, no political power, no empire to protect his legacy. Muhammad lived in a society where writing already existed and where a powerful empire later formed around his name. And yet, historically speaking, the earliest sources for Jesus are closer to his life than the earliest narrative sources for Muhammad are to his. Let that sink in. Earlier sources, closer witnesses, shorter gap. This is not Christian theology. This is a secular historian explains how evidence works. And when the same historical standards are applied to the both figures, the common claim fails. The life of Jesus is not more legendary than the life of Muhammad. If anything, the opposite is true. The confidence Muslims have about Muhammad is built on later tradition, not early evidence. The historical problem Islam faces is not Jesus, it's Muhammad.